And everybody, my name is Chris Lenhardt, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here today to the second webinar being put forth by the RENCI Accelerating Collaborative Team Science activity. And the series that we're promoting is Team Science in the Academic Research Enterprise. As I said, I'm Chris Lenhardt. I am a research scientist at the Renaissance Computing Institute at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I work in our Earth Data Science group, and I've had the pleasure of working with Steve the past few years, our speaker today, and I'll introduce him more in a minute, but just a quick couple of agenda notes. First of all, we're basically going to have two parts to this webinar. The initial part will be a bit of a chat back and forth between Dr. Fiore and myself, and then we very much would like to hear from attendees, those of you out there in the audience. And we have a Zoom retro board, a retro board to enable you all to put questions in, and then we'll kind of do some back and forth with that during the second part, and instructions and things like that will show up in the chat as we go. So please keep an eye on that. All right, without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Fiore. As I said, I've had the pleasure of working with him the past few years. Steve is the Pegasus Professor of Cognitive Sciences in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Central Florida. And he also he's the director of the Cognitive Sciences Laboratory at the Institute for Simulation and Training. And I'll turn it over to Steve to say a few more words about his background and what we'll be talking about.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for having me. It's exciting to be able to talk to folks about this topic. My primary area of research is understanding collaborative cognition in complex contexts. And I've been studying teams for a number of years now. And as part of that, obviously, one area of importance is studying scientific teamwork, and hence the science of team science is an approach Kara Hall, Dan Stokels, Bob Croyle, a number of researchers started the National Cancer Institute back in the 2000s, where their goal was to think about how can we apply the scientific method to study teamwork in science. And I got involved with them, and we started our kind of community of practice, this annual conference. And I'm here with you to talk not simply about teamwork, but with a specific emphasis on trying to understand scientific teamwork.
Great, thanks, Stephen. I should have mentioned that Steve alluded to the Community of Practice, the International Network of the Science of Team Science, or INSIGHTS. He is a former president of that organization and one of the leaders in that group. So what we would like to do to kick off the conversation is just to reiterate what the basic sort of definition of team science is. And for that, we turn to the one from the National Cancer Institute, and that is that team science is a collaborative effort to address a scientific challenge that leverages the strengths and expertise of professionals, often trained in different fields. And although the traditional single investigator-driven approaches are ideal for many scientific endeavors, coordinated teams of investigators with diverse skills and knowledge may be especially helpful for tackling complex scientific and societal problems. Those are the problems I like to call, or have heard others call, the wicked problems. So let's see what we can learn more about teamwork and team processes. The previous webinar was a little bit more focused, arguably, on sort of practical and lived experiences from folks around the university and elsewhere. And I think today, one of the values in this conversation that we'll be able to learn more about from Steve is kind of linking some of the more theoretical elements of understandings of team science with these practical kinds of questions and things like that. So without wasting too much time, I'm going to go ahead and dive in. We'll have these moderated questions. And again, just to reiterate, if you have questions you'd like to potentially have us address during the second half, put them in the chat board or make the retro board, or make a note of them and then add them later. So the first question is, what are the fundamental processes of teamwork in scientific research? And again, I'm hoping Steve maybe link in the sort of theoretical parts with the practical parts. I know we tend to talk about, or you talk about things like teamwork versus task work, which I think is an interesting distinction to make in these contexts.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best place to start when trying to get people to understand what we want to accomplish with the science of team science is this particular focus on teamwork. And the distinction between teamwork and task work is very relevant and important here. Task work is simply what needs to be accomplished. Why is the team together in the first place? What are the objectives? And this is really the work of the science team. And you contrast that with teamwork, which is basically how does that work get done? And I'll go in a little bit more detail about teamwork, but the distinction matters because scientists have spent their entire lives, they spent their careers, and even after they're done with school, they're still getting more information, they're still learning, they're becoming more of an expert on task work. So they're getting better at their science. But the issue is they are rarely, if ever, trained on teamwork. And these collaborative processes, we break those down into the attitudinal, behavioral, and cognitive kind of processes that facilitate the actual work that a scientific team needs to accomplish. So what do they need to function effectively from the attitudinal standpoint? What do they need to function effectively from the behavioral and from the cognitive standpoint? So when we break it down into these attitudes, these behaviors, and cognition, we can then go into a lot of detail about each one of those primary categories, because within the study of teams and in the social sciences more generally, those are topics that have a rich and long history. And what we have been doing is thinking about their relevance to scientific teamwork. Just as an example, a lot of people have resonated with this idea of psychological safety, and that's one of the core attitudes that we see as being important for effective teams. And that essentially means, are you comfortable enough in your team to take risks? Do you have a fear or no fear of persecution from superiors? If you make a mistake, do you feel you're going to be punished, or are you the team going to learn from it? So a psychologically safe environment is one where you're not worried about mistakes, where you're not worrying about risk taking. You're comfortable with the environment in such a way that there's a culture that allows you to behave in a way where you can pursue what you want to pursue. You can question the authority on that team. And again, that's just one example of the many attitudes that get studied in science teams and in teams more generally. But more importantly, it's one of the more robust phenomena in the study of teams that consistently shows that when teams are psychologically safe, they tend to perform better.
So thanks, Steve. I want to, if I could add, because I know it's another sort of element in particular to what you research, which is the idea of technology as a teammate. Could you maybe say a couple words about that in the context of these fundamental processes?
Sure, that's interesting. When we think about technology, this is something that's going to cut across the attitudes, the behavior, and the cognition of teams. And there's a number of different ways to view technology. So you just quoted technology as teammate, which was one of the titles of an initial paper where we were trying to think about how the technology is extending cognition. And when we think about then technology and the science of team science, it's going to come into play in a number of different ways. And probably most familiar to just about everyone who's listening is the technology that you have had to learn how to use because of the pandemic. So because of Zoom, or because of the pandemic, Zoom became the go-to technology. Fortunately, it was very easy to use compared to some of the earlier technologies. If you're old enough, you might remember Skype and Skyping. Yes, it was a verb. It was that powerful. It was that prevalent that they actually referred to as Skyping. But that was really the first go-to video tool that we had. And that's just an example of a technology that has facilitated our ability to meet and to collaborate with people who with whom we are not co-located. And just as a bit of historical trivia here, some of the initial research on the study of science teams was done in that context. So Judith Olson, Gary Olson, they were actually funded by the National Science Foundation in the early 2000s when this thing called the internet was becoming very popular and essentially ubiquitous. And NSF realized that it was allowing scientists to collaborate in a way they had never been before. And there was a concept referred to as a collaboratory, which was a virtual kind of laboratory. And what the Olsons were tasked to do was trying to study the interaction that was occurring when people were using these technologies that was connecting them over time and space. So that's just the real world example of how technology affects our lives. But when you dive more deeply into it, it becomes challenging because Zoom, sure, it's a nice technology to have a meeting, to talk to people, but we miss the kind of artifacts that we can use in co-located environments. So the go-to example is the whiteboard. And when you are working on a particularly difficult problem, someone's going to rush to the whiteboard and start jotting ideas down. And Zoom has added a whiteboard. We can debate long and hard as to whether or not the Zoom whiteboard is an effective one. There are other online tools that have been developed to try to extend cognition to facilitate this virtual collaboration. But that's a ripe area of research. It's an important area of research. And I think there's some questions that need to be asked about the degree to which we can function effectively using these tools that are meant to extend our cognition over a virtual setting and see the degree to which they really are aiding us, or at least a decent surrogate for co-location.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And brings to mind a number of other questions. We'll just have to have you back, I think, but we'll come back to that. So following up on that, you kind of have this setup of the processes and whatnot, and the task work and the teamwork. So how do the teams track how well they're doing? You know, their performance and progress, those kinds of things.
Well, that presupposes teams are tracking how well they're doing. And I think that the vast majority of teams really are assessing the degree to which they're meeting their objectives. If a team is familiar with any kind of project management, if they have any kind of complex task they need to accomplish, they will have milestones, they will have some kind of markers for what needs to get done, who needs to get it done, and when it needs to get done. So that's how they'll assess the task work. And then when you think about some of the technologies that have been developed to help assess what's getting done, one example that I often bring up is something like a Gantt chart. And I use that as an example because it's a nice blend of task work and teamwork. The teamwork component comes in when you use a Gantt chart to help identify the roles. So an important component of teamwork is understanding who is responsible for what on your team. And this gets into a cognitive component. We sometimes refer to shared cognition as a transactive memory system. We sometimes refer to shared mental models. We'll talk about concepts like metacognition. Across each one of those, roles is invariant, meaning across any one of those forms of shared cognition, when we think about teamwork, it's an understanding of who is supposed to be doing what is their expertise in a particular area, who do I need to go to help me do something, who is not doing their work well, who is doing their work well. So a Gantt chart is going to help you keep in mind who's supposed to be doing what and whether or not certain tasks are getting done. So that's just one simple example of how teams should be trying to monitor their performance. But your question, really, you want to understand, how do teams monitor more of their collaboration, their actual teamwork? And this could get at the degree to which they have implemented some kind of self-assessment. And some teams, I'd say in industry, a good example is what we would consider a debrief. So I know in like software and engineering, they call it a hot wash. There's any kind of term that's been developed to engage in reflective behavior after a particular performance episode. So this depends on the team. It could be you just had an important meeting, or you just finished a project, good teams will assess, good teams will reflect upon what they just did, and they'll try to identify what went well, what went poorly. And I use the phrase debrief, but this is an idea that goes back a number of years now. There's the briefing, there's the debriefing. The military's been doing that for a number of years. That's been adopted by healthcare. We know sports teams engage in that kind of activity where they'll prepare for something and then they'll reflect upon that something. And I think that's probably one of the processes that we see people in industry engaged in somewhat regularly at better organizations. And when it comes to scientific teamwork, we are trying to recommend that teams engage in some kind of feedback where they are trying to understand and assess and reflect upon their own collaborative processes. But that's been research is needed to see first, how many science teams have adopted that? And second, what are they doing? What are the kinds of scaffolds that they're using in order to guide whatever is that reflection might be?
Excellent. And actually you anticipated a question I was going to throw out there, which was how about adoption. I want to come back. We'll come back to this next kind of thing about other ways to provide feedback and improve performance. But is there any kind of understanding about how well teams adopt these kinds of processes or ways that that adoption can be fostered?
Well, I say we don't have data on how many teams have adopted this in the scientific community. I think the way to do it, the way to guide it or ensure it is really going to boil down to the organizational culture. That could be at the level of a lab. It could be at the level of something like a center or an institute. And in that, it has to do with the leadership. So are the people who are the PIs, the co-PIs, willing to engage in that kind of process and that kind of behavior? Because the reality is people are busy, and sometimes people don't want to take the time to reflect on their behavior. And the way to get around that, one of the things that often works is to use data from actual experiments that have been conducted to help persuade whomever may be the scientists in charge and say, look, we know these are painful. We know these are not pleasant for people to pursue, but data suggests it will improve your performance and you will be better as an organization or as a team. So those are some of the kind of methods that could be implemented. But as I said, you have people who are just naturally good at this in a leadership position and will come to that in a more intuitive way and will reflect on and do the walkarounds and check in with people to see how things are going. And that kind of blurs the boundary between the individual and the team, because when I say a check-in, that check-in could be at the level of the team or it could be at the level of the individual. And even if it's at the level of the individual, it's not simply how are you doing, it's how are things going in your collaborations. So those kinds of check-ins can still foster performance improvements at the collaborative or team level as well.
Nice. And I think that is actually kind of leads into the next question, which is, are there other ways, proven ways to do this kind of feedback and improve the performance? So I don't know if you have any other thoughts there, but I was going to suggest a generalization of this question and say, how do teams learn? How do they learn to do better? How do they learn to improve their performance? So I don't know if you have other ways besides these things like check-ins and debriefs and.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could go into any level of detail with the various assessment tools that have been developed over the years in the study of teams. And that's one of the important steps when it comes to the science of team science, is seeing the degree to which people are adapting or adopting the measures that currently exist. And that gets at your question because you could use some of these tools to facilitate the reflection. One of the key distinctions that's important here has to do with whether it's self-ratings, peer ratings, or both. And what the data seems to show in the study of groups and teams in general is it's better to have both self and peer ratings of performance because the self ratings, obviously, it's your belief, your perception, your subjective assessment of how well you are doing. The peer ratings are obviously how your colleagues think you are doing, and it's the discrepancy between those that really matter. And getting the feedback about some kind of discrepancy between self and peer ratings is a very powerful kind of feedback. So that's you asked, how do teams learn? And one way they can do that at a more general level is seeing the differences between their teamwork and their self-perceptions of their teamwork and their colleagues or peers' assessment of their teamwork. And again, that's all very general. I could get into detail about what are they specifically measuring. Things they may be measuring are behavioral components. Are people contributing to the team the way they are supposed to? How are they doing at an interpersonal level? Are they fostering a sense of trust? Are they engaging in the right kind of backup behavior to help keep the team on track? Are they demonstrating their knowledge, their skills, essentially their abilities of how to work well on the team? And you can dig even deeper if you want to look at things like conflict processes. How are they managing conflict when it arises? But even conflict itself is a multifaceted concept that has been studied, and there's been a number of different publications on it. And conflict is an interesting one because not all conflict is bad. And this is something that the message that's always important to get across when you're working with teams is you want to foster a certain kind of conflict around the ideas. You want what we can think of as task conflict. So the easiest way to break down the distinction is the task work teamwork distinction. But in the team's literature, there is this task conflict, and that has to do with your awareness of the viewpoints of other team members. But more importantly, are you discussing those differences? Are you trying to comprehend? Are you trying to take the perspective of your colleagues? Are you discussing the pros and the cons of the way they think about something, the way you think about something yourself? Are you evaluating the ideas in such a way that you're trying to truly identify what is the better idea? So that's the kind of task conflict that's good. And you can connect that back to psychological safety. One of the attitudes I mentioned earlier, you're only going to see that kind of productive task conflict, this behavioral measure, you're only going to see that when it is aligned with this attitudinal component I mentioned earlier, which is the psychological safety. So that's what makes these things seem simple, but you have to recognize the way they're related with each other. But when people think about conflict, they often think about interpersonal conflict, the negative kind of conflict that often arises in groups or teams. That has to do with the tension or the friction that may exist. It could be because there was a bad experience before. It could have something to do with the way a supervisor is treating people. But you can dig deeper in conflict. And there's a couple of different facets of conflict I think that really matter for science teams. One would be like logistical conflict that has to do with our people meeting their deadlines? Are people using the resources in a timely way? When you think about some of these really complex scientific projects that are out there, there's laboratory space, there's equipment that needs to be used, and that creates this kind of coordination logistical conflict that needs to be understood and needs to be managed well. And then contribution conflict is another big one. And I think everybody is familiar with contribution conflict. When you're working on a project, are they doing what they are supposed to be doing? And referring back to the Gantt chart, I always recommend some kind of tool like that as a way to help manage contribution and to help deal with contribution conflict. It helps with contribution conflict because Gantt charts are created ahead of time. Gantt charts should be co-created, and they essentially become an agreement of sorts that says, okay, I understand what I'm supposed to do, but more importantly, I understand when I'm supposed to do it and who is going to rely on me. So now we're connecting a particular kind of tool or aid, like a Gantt chart, to a behavioral problem, like a contribution conflict. And that's now showing this relationship between technology as an aid to the team and how it can facilitate addressing some kind of behavioral problems like contribution conflict.
So Steve, if I could prolong this theme just a little bit, I would say the kinds of things that you have been describing really focused on those two of the three dimensions, the attitudinal and the behavioral. How do you do feedback and sort of performance stuff related to the cognition part that, you know, everybody has a similar understanding of what the work is all about and what the research questions are and all that? Are there ways to help with that element as well?
Do you mean, so you said, how do you provide feedback about
Well, like, I guess the way I would phrase it is, you know, if cognition is one of these elements of team performance, and the way I would describe that is, you know, do we have a common understanding of our task work? You know, do we all understand the research question the same way?
right.
How do we know that we know that? Let's put it one way.
So that is related to a particular kind of team cognition we refer to as a shared mental model. And the shared mental model idea came out of the study of teams in complex environments. It has to do with what you're describing as the task mental model, but also the team mental model. So the task mental model is what you were talking about when you said shared understanding of what we need to do. In the shared mental model theory, they also talk about the teamwork component, which could be the roles, but just as important, it's the interdependencies that have been identified, who is relying on whom. And often they would talk about the equipment. Is there a shared mental model of the equipment? And when looking at shared mental model theory and the research that's been done on it in other contexts, the data suggests that if there is a shared understanding of the task, the team, and things like the equipment, you'll see a higher level of coordination. And you'll see what we refer to as this kind of implicit coordination, which is essentially the ability to work together without having to talk to each other. And that's because they know what they are supposed to do. So a situation arises, and remember, a lot of the team research has been studying what are called action teams. And action teams are teams that work in high stress environments, life and death situations. They have a particular performance episode. This could be law enforcement. This could be emergency personnel. This could be in aviation, healthcare, surgery, military. Teams where they have to work oftentimes quickly, but again, in high stakes environments. And that's where the study of shared mental models was initiated. But it has shown that when teams in those settings have a shared mental model, they can coordinate more smoothly, and they can do so without much explicit communication because they're able to look at an environmental situation, identify something is amiss. We didn't expect this, but know enough about each other, know enough about expertise, and know without having to explicitly say, know what they should do next. So that concept has been migrated to non-action teams, teams like product development teams, software teams, and now science teams. So the degree to which they have this shared understanding is going to be crucial to their effective performance. And then you're getting now to your question, how do they know that they have a shared mental model? That is one of the million-dollar questions, and there's not a whole lot of data as of yet. But what you would see is the different phases of a team from a developmental standpoint, the differential development of that shared mental model. So oftentimes when a team is first coming together, let's say they want to work on a grant and they haven't worked together before, or it's a new area of research, those initial meetings are going to be the places at which the shared mental model and lack thereof are going to become apparent. And this is where listening, active listening, another important behavioral component, is going to be crucial. Because if you've attended any talk, any discussion, any session about science teamwork, one of the first things that comes up is, oh, I was surprised that they use this different term to describe the same thing that we talk about. And this differences in concept names, labels, the difference in vocabulary across disciplines is something that hinders the development of shared mental models. And it's only when teams engage in active listening and assertive communication do they come to realize that they have different terminology to describe the same concept, or they have a similar term that describes different ideas. And those kinds of things must be reconciled for the team to have a shared mental model. And that can only be reconciled through this kind of communication processes like active listening and assertive listening or assertive communication, so that they can bring to the forefront, make explicit the kinds of differences that I just mentioned.
Yeah, again, this is really fascinating because you have the elements of defining things, learning, culture development, and all that. So again, I'm going to vote for bringing you back, but we're running out of time for this this section, and I think we have one more question, which is kind of very practical oriented, which we've been talking about all these different elements. Are there places that you would point folks to look for more resources on these kinds of topics like assessment?
Yeah, I think when it comes to assessment, depending upon who the people are, there are different capabilities out there. The first and foremost, I'd recommend that they reach out to one of these communities of practice. So you already mentioned the International Network for the Science of Team Science. What the National Cancer Institute had done was create the Team Science Toolkit, but unfortunately for budgetary reasons, that's down now. But that did have a repository of a number of measures. I'm bringing it up, though, because toolkits has become a very popular term. And I see toolkits being developed by a number of different organizations. I see them being developed in a number of different countries. So a lot of people recognize the value of this idea of a toolkit, and a toolkit, just calling it that, is an interesting scholarly issue, because toolkit can mean different things to different people. But the toolkits that I'm seeing arise, the ones with which I'm familiar, are trying to address things like assessment. What are the right kinds of questions you want to ask to monitor performance? But one thing we didn't really talk about when it comes to assessment and monitoring and the tools that are out there is you need to be careful. You need to be clear about what it is you are measuring and what you are seeking, because the tool is going to define the outcome. And when we think about scientific processes and we think about scientific outcomes, there's a lot that can be measured. So I've been really in the weeds giving you specific examples of the kinds of things to measure, like conflict, but you can step back and you could say, well, let's look at the team as a whole. Let's look at how they have developed. Have they developed shared mental models? Have they come to a common ground where they're a newly formed team from interdisciplinary backgrounds? Do they now share an understanding that they didn't before? So that's something that's going to be more difficult, be more time consuming, that it's going to have to be measured over the course of months, that you want to assess. You also want to look at the traditional kinds of outcomes, like the publications. And I know people don't like counting publications, but the reason publications or conference papers or the like matter is it fits with your question about shared mental models. And I often recommend this whenever I do workshops for universities about how to improve their collaboration. I recommend just working on something like a white paper or something like a conceptual paper where they're trying to bring together their ideas, because it's only in the act of writing. It's only when they're discussing the concepts for the purposes of making them concrete enough for a paper do they realize that they have a difference in understanding about something. And in order to write that paper, they have to reconcile those differences. So I'm able to motivate those kinds of teams because every academic wants a publication, but it's really just a kind of training. It's really just a way to force them to sit down at the proverbial table and talk about the ideas in such a way that they're going to develop a shared understanding of what it is that they're trying to accomplish.
That's great. That's fascinating. I think that I see that happen in proposal writing as well. So
Yep.
thank you very, very much. Fascinating and really interesting. I think we'd like to turn now to see what the audience has to say and what questions they might have. So I think the instructions have been posted a number of times about how to access the retro board. But I think Amanda's going to walk us through it one more time.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks so much, guys, for a really rich conversation. This has been fantastic. And now we are excited to hear from our audience. So, folks, we're going to give you some tips on how to use Easy Retro. To add your questions, click on the link, the plus sign in the relevant column. Type your question or idea. When you're finished, hit the blue box with a thin white check mark, and that will save it within the same field. And then your idea will appear on the screen for the public's reaction. And you can also upvote or comment another idea or question by using the thumbs up icon. And you can comment on an idea by using the quote bubble icon. And just to be clear, we will begin with the questions that have the most likes or upvotes. So we do encourage you to take a look at this board and begin to upvote the ideas that you want to have the panelists answer first. We will also be moving our answered questions over to the far right column, which says answered. Thanks so much, folks.
Yes, and thanks, Amanda. And I was perusing the questions as you were talking, and then I'm like, oh, well, I know which one I'd like to start with. But in keeping with what you just said with the upvotes, we have a question at the top here about assessment and asking whether there's quantitative metrics for assessing capacity for effective teamwork, either at the individual or group level. So, Steve, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yes, it's interesting that one moved to the front, because that was probably one of the very first things that was assessed. So you heard me mention Kara Hall and Dan Stokels, Amanda Vogel. So these were the people at the National Cancer Institute within what was referred to as the Team Science Division. And they were the ones who were charged with trying to develop and understand collaborative processes in National Cancer Institute funded centers. So one of the things they did to assess this question was created what was called the Collaboration Readiness Scale. And in the Collaboration Readiness Scale were questions that asked about things like potential for productivity, then the potential for coordinating across different parts of the center. So collaboration readiness was trying to look at, so the term here in the question, the capacity for, which is important because Maritza Salazar has developed a measure of integrative capacity that I'll get at in a second. But this collaboration readiness is also a measure of capacity or potential, and it assesses the things like their orientation towards working with people from different disciplines. It assesses things like the degree to which they are able to work with people from different fields. It assesses things like the degree to which they share resources within their research environment. So the collaboration readiness scale tries to understand the potential for people's ability to work with those from different disciplines on a new kind of project. And relevant to your question earlier, your interest about technology, Chris, it also talked about technology readiness as well, the degree to which the people and their organizational unit was ready from a technological standpoint to conduct the kind of research that was needed. And just to wrap that part up, Kara Hall and colleagues have since developed a kind of collaboration assessment and overall view of collaboration readiness that they've written about. And what they're trying to accomplish there is not only help people assess, but help people prepare for teamwork. And what they mean in that regard is when you're preparing something like a research proposal that is fairly complicated, or when you're about to start on a research endeavor that's fairly complicated, you should spend as much time thinking about the science as you should about the collaboration. So I think it's chapter 14 in Kara Hall and colleagues' 2019 book on collaboration, readiness and collaboration potential that you can take a look at. But you can email me and I'll get you the correct chapter. It's available online for you to download. So it looks at these kinds of collaboration questions and collaboration issues.
Excellent, excellent. So shifting gears a little bit, but I think it's definitely related, at least in my mind anyways, when we talk about these processes, great question about how you motivate PIs to incorporate or engage team science processes. When, I've heard it in the data management, we don't want to sacrifice resources for data management. We want to use that for the science. I could imagine the same thing here. We don't want to sacrifice resources towards addressing team science when we just want to focus on the research. So how do you help PIs to get over that?
Yes, so the expression, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink.
Exactly.
Well, I brought up some of this before, is by using data to persuade them, because scientists will respond to data, otherwise they're just going to blow it off and say, well, no, I don't need that. And you have to have a set of ways to persuade the scientists, that the PIs, that this matters. And data is just one that you can think about in your toolkit, so to speak, your persuasive toolkit, to convince them that it's something that will be helpful. An easy one for people to adopt is like the brief and the debrief idea. And there are resources out there, lots of resources out there for briefing and debriefing. And I say they're easy, but not simply because the resources are available, but you can do them in different settings and practice them and see the degree to which people are resonating to it. So, maybe you have an important meeting coming up, and you could use that as an opportunity to brief and prepare for, and then debrief to see the degree to which it worked well. So if you can persuade a PI that there's no harm in trying one of these tools and making it easy for them to try one of those tools, then I think that might work. Another possible way is to use persuasion as a benefit, not simply for the science, but for the professional development of the members of the team. So if this scientist cares as much about the intellectual professional development of their team, you can show them that this will help them become better collaborators and then be more productive scientists. So it's a kind of professional development mentoring way that you persuade them to pay attention to these process improvements.
Excellent. So thank you for that. Under miscellaneous, another question that I've heard a version of in my own work here is, can you explain a little bit more about how team science, or the science of team science, is different than just simply adding project management to a research project?
Yeah, I do get that one a lot as well. And the first thing is that I think scientists, the more complicated their projects are, they do need to adopt project management tools. And I say they need to do that because project management tools have been developed specifically to foster, here's the key distinction, task work. So this is why teamwork versus task work is a fundamental theoretical concept and a practical concept matters. So project management is simply a way to coordinate the task work. And unless there are project management tools out there that have been designed to help address attitudinal things like psychological safety or building cohesion or trust, unless there are project management tools that are out there that are facilitating behavioral components such as conflict management, or unless there's project management tools that are out there helping teams engage in cognitive processes and develop metacognitive processes, then that's a big difference. Project management tools were there and invented to foster task work. And as an outcome, as an emergent property, yes, they did facilitate teamwork, but their primary purpose is to help with task work.
Excellent. I'm going to remember that when I encounter that question in the future. So jumping back to, thank you, questions about assessment, I'm going to do moderator prerogative here. And the question there at the bottom, whether systems thinking can contribute to evaluation of teamwork processes. It's a little bit of a departure from the way we've been talking about it, but I'm curious to see if you had some thoughts on that.
Well, systems thinking is one of those concept that means different things to different people. So I'm not quite sure what kind of systems thinking someone might, that this person is asking about. I have a fairly simplistic view of systems thinking. I think about systems as moving across levels, like from the individual to the group or team, and then to the organization. And then all of that is a system that exists in order to produce some productive outcome. Some people would go further and say society is part of that system. So systems thinking then is not simply the recognition of these different levels of interaction, but the interdependencies across these levels and the forces of influence across these levels. So I think systems thinking at a conceptual level can help unpack the nuances, the intricacies associated with scientific teamwork. But I don't know enough about systems level thinking measures to make a recommendation about assessment of teamwork.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. Teamwork processes. Question that says, how can institutions, or what role do institutions play in helping teams do what they need to do?
So many things. First and foremost, what has consistently been an issue and what always comes up, when I go give workshops or talk to other universities, are the assistant professors who are in the audience worried about tenure and promotion. And they're worried about tenure and promotion because they're in a department that either prioritizes PI-driven, often lone PI projects, or more likely, they are in a department that does not reward and may even punish interdisciplinary collaboration. So I hear instances of, if I don't have X number of single authored or first authored papers, I'm not going to get tenure. Or if I don't publish in the following set of journals, I'm not going to get tenure. So one of the ways that this can be addressed, and it's important because universities have been paying lip service to interdisciplinary for decades now. They need to put their money where their mouth is, to mix metaphors, and influence the development of tenure and promotion policies that reward teamwork and interdisciplinarity in science rather than punish it. So that's probably one of the most important ways that organizations can support it. And I can suggest some others, or we can take another question if you want.
Well, I was just, what occurred to me was thinking, not to harp on sort of the measures and a traditional measure like bibliometrics, but the research in team science that shows, that there's a lot to be gained. The bibliometric research that shows there's a lot to be gained from these team science things can feed back into the kind of stuff that you were just talking about as proof, right?
Yes, I think that gets at the evidence using empirical data to help persuade leaders in universities or in labs or in institutes that these things matter.
Yes. Okay, so yeah, let's take another question. This one from the miscellaneous. I think it's a really interesting question. Are there suggestions, practices, best practices, resources, if you're a PI that's inheriting an underperforming team?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in that one. The first thing, ignoring the underperforming part, is the turnover issue. So in the social organizational sciences, turnover is an important sub area of research, and it's studied for any number of reasons. Relevant here, one of the reasons is something like knowledge loss. If it's a PI issue, it then runs into changes in leadership, and changes in leadership are going to create a different kind of dynamic because that's altering the culture, which is going to influence the behavior. The knowledge loss, whether it be PI or a member of the team, is going to affect the task work. It's going to affect the shared mental models. So back to the specifics of this question, immediately, one thing that comes to mind is not necessarily resources, but turning the bug into a feature. That is, taking advantage of the fact that they're a new PI and they can use their naivete and their ignorance and say, I want to understand what this team is doing. I want to understand what is the scientific project or what you're trying to accomplish. So what they're doing is using their naivete to force the team to articulate a mental model, and hopefully in that process, and they're going to need to facilitate it to make sure they're explicit, hopefully the team will come to realize they don't have a shared mental model, or they have a counterproductive shared mental model. That is, the PI can use the fact that they're new as a way to elicit from the team what should be the shared mental model. And it's only in this kind of explicit process that it's going to make the team realize that they do not share understanding. And if the difference is there when I see counterproductive, that then becomes a point of discussion. Because I'm not quite sure what counterproductive shared mental model means. I'm inferring it means they have a different goal and different goals. So that is then a leverage point for discussion. Like, why do you want to accomplish this and this other team member wants to accomplish that?
Excellent. So there's some other questions that are kind of related to that, but I think we have time for one more, and I'm going to grab one from the teamwork processes one. The third one down. How would you navigate a situation if a team had too many leaders?
Yeah, this is like I said, referring back to the social and organizational sciences in general. This creates a kind of role conflict in the sense that I'm inferring that what's driving the problem is the leaders are giving conflicting orders, or the leaders are telling specific people to do different things. And the phrasing "navigate a situation" is a particular, an interesting one, because it doesn't say how do you address or solve. It means how do you deal with. So if the question is really how do you deal with, then I'm inferring that the person feels they're in a situation they can't change it, They just need to figure out how to deal with it, that is, how to navigate it. And I think the one way to address it would be to talk about the potential role conflict that one may be experiencing. Because if there are multiple leaders, that becomes a problem when they're telling people, like I said, they're telling people to do different things. And this is where meetings matter. This is where the co-location and the explicit articulation and verbalization of some of these things can be useful, where you bring to the forefront the conflicts. Like, well, wait a minute, you're telling me to do X, but she's telling me to do Y. And how are we to do both of those things when they may be sequential, they may have a different kind of interdependency that's preventing you from accomplishing them. So that's just one example of using explicit communication, assertive communication, to bring to the forefront what may be driving some kind of role conflict or shared understanding conflict that the leaders, multiple leaders, are presenting to that team.
Excellent. I think we're going to have to leave it at that. I like how you can take sort of these understandings from team science and kind of flip them around to use these, when these problems crop up, to use them to leverage the conversation to make the team better. So I want to thank you, Steve. It was really fascinating. I enjoyed it. I want to thank the participants for all their questions. Those for your participants, we'll be sending out the link to the slides so you can have the links to information and so on. Please stay tuned for our next webinar, which is scheduled for June 13th. There'll be more information on that coming up about the guests. Take a look at our listserv if you want to stay up to date. And there is a recording from the April webinar if you want to take a look at that, which the information will be provided in chat. And Leah and Amanda, I don't know if I missed anything. Let me know or pipe up. And
You're all set.
Thank you,
Thank you all.
everybody.
And anyone can feel free to email me with questions. I'm happy to shoot them resources.
Thanks so much, Steve. Thanks, Chris. And thanks so much, everyone who has joined and stuck around to the very last minute. Applause, applause to all. All right. Thanks,
Appreciate
everyone.
it.
Have a great
Take
day.
care. Thanks.
Thanks all. See ya.